"You want to buy the garbage?" The manager said it with a half laugh in it. It was the kind a grown man uses on a kid who has said something he finds charming. "You're a driver. You're not a salesman. Nobody buys garbage. And if somebody did, we'd have sold it in 1980. Every night, a 19-year-old backed a flatbed to the lip of a pit behind the cooler. He dumped close to 2 tons of broken flowers into a hole in the ground. Bent necks, split stems, dahlias that had opened 2 days early and would be blown wide by the time a truck reached Cleveland. The farm paid a man to come twice a season and turn it under with a skid loader. That was the entire life cycle of 90% of what 600 acres produced. He had done the math once, sitting in the cab with the engine ticking. If a single stem was worth a nickel, and if he dumped somewhere north of 40,000 stems a night, then the number was enormous. Every time he pulled that lever, he was pouring $2,000 into a hole. He knew the number was wrong. Broken flowers weren't worth a nickel. Broken flowers weren't worth anything. That was the whole point. That was why there was a hole. 18 months later, designers in New York were on a waiting list for what came out of that pit. This is not a story about a boy who found something valuable in the garbage. He didn't find anything. It was all sitting in plain sight. It had been sitting there for 40 years, and the reason nobody picked it up is the reason worth telling. His name is Malik Osi. He is 19 years old. He has $61 and a book he can barely read. And the thing he is actually going to spend the summer doing is not making money. It is putting a name back on something erased on purpose. Twice. Once by the woman who made it, and once by the people about to sell it without her. The pit was Malik's because nobody with any seniority wanted the night route. He was the lowest name on the payroll at Halloway Flower Company, and the farm had a way of communicating that to him without ever quite saying it. He backed the flatbed to the lip, worked the hydraulics, and watched the totes slide down, grey plastic bins off the end of the grading line, full of everything the buyers wouldn't take. Kinked necks, split calyxes, a whole planting of something that had snapped in a May wind and come in flat. In June, the pit smelled like tea left out too long. In August, it smelled like something else. He was 19 years and 4 months old, and 6 weeks earlier they had buried his grandmother. And in his mother's house, 6 weeks was still the middle of it. Eleanor Osi, everybody who had known her longer than a week called her Ruthie, had cut and bunched flowers for Halloway for 31 years. She came on in the spring of 1995, when the fields were 400 acres, and the grading line was 3 women at a folding table, and she outlasted 2 owners and 1 fire. She could strip the foliage off a stem faster than a machine, and with less damage. She could look at a dahlia in the field at 6 in the morning in fog, and tell you within half a day when to cut it. The farm gave her a plaque at year 25 that she kept in a drawer with the rubber bands. Her hands were always stained. Not dirt-stained. Malik had known dirt his whole life, and dirt washed off. Ruthie's hands carried a color that lived under the nails and along the creases of the knuckles. A rust brown that went yellow at the edges when it was fading, and came back deeper by the next week. Some seasons it climbed past her wrists. He asked her about it once, when he was small enough to be sitting on her kitchen counter. She looked at her own hands like she was checking whether he was right. "It's the dirt, baby." He asked again at 12 and got the same answer in the same voice, and after that he stopped, the way a person stops asking about anything an adult answers identically twice. She had kept a bucket, not at the farm, at her own place, a white house on a half-acre with a garden she ran like a small country. In the evenings she would come out with a 5-gallon pail and walk the beds and take the broken ones, the bent necks, the blackened edges, anything that would never make it into a vase. She carried them around back, past the shed. What happened after that Malik never watched, because he was a kid, and it was boring, and there was television. She had left that house to his mother. 6 weeks on, neither of them had spent a night in it. Sharon drove past it twice a week on the way to the pharmacy counter, and had not once turned in. And Malik understood without being told that a house you cannot yet enter is a different object from a house you own. so they kept renting, and the White House sat there with the garden going to seed. Here is the part he could not have explained to anybody. He was doing a version of the bucket himself. Every night, before he worked the hydraulics, he climbed onto the bed of the truck with an empty pail and pulled out a double handful of whatever was on top. Cosmos, coreopsis, whatever the line had thrown away that day. He set the pail in the passenger footwell, drove it home, and left it by the carport door. And in the morning it was there, and he looked at it and went to bed. It was not a plan. It was closer to the way people keep setting a fifth place at the table for a while after. Holloway wanted her locker cleaned out. The request came through his mother from the office, phrased the way those things get phrased. No rush, whenever it's convenient. We're just reorganizing the tool shed. Ruthie had kept a locker in that shed for 31 years, a tall grey one at the end of a row, and the office wanted the space. Sharon said she could go. Then a week went by, and another, and Malik understood without discussion that he was going instead. He went on a Sunday, in the third week of May, in the middle of the afternoon, when the fields were empty and the cooler was locked, and the whole place had the stopped quality a working farm gets, 1 day a week. He knew what he was after, a box of photographs she had kept in there, one of the flat cardboard kind a shirt comes in. The locker gave him the box, a windbreaker, 2 pairs of cotton gloves worn through at the thumb, and a coffee can of hair, elastics, and rubber bands. He was ready to leave when he noticed the door on the low cabinet, under the workbench, standing open about 2 inches. That end of the shed was hers by long custom, the way people take ownership of the space beside their own locker without anyone deciding it. Inside were feed sacks, stiff with old damp stacked 5 deep. They had not been moved in a while. He moved them because he was already there, and because the box in his other hand felt lighter than he wanted it to. Under the sacks was a ledger. It was smaller than a ledger ought to be. Cloth cover, the spine cracked white the way a book cracks when it has been opened past its own comfort a few thousand times. In the bottom corner, 3 initials pressed into the cloth in gold that had mostly worn off. E.R.O. Eleanor Ruth Osey. Her name before she married, which Malik had seen exactly once on the funeral home paperwork and had thought at the time was a stranger's name. He sat down on an upturned crate with the shed door open behind him and put the photographs on the floor. The first 40 pages were money, dates on the left, hours in the middle, amounts on the right. A wage of $6.50 an hour, then 7, then 8. The numbers climbing so slowly across so many pages that watching them do it turned something over in his chest. She had kept her own record, 31 years of checking somebody else's math. Then the column stopped. The handwriting on the next page was hers, and also was not. Smaller, tighter, faster. The kind of hand a person writes in at night with a lamp turned low so the light doesn't reach the rest of the house. Boiled 6-quart stem waste, 2 tablespooned alum, dahlia rust. Wool took color fast, cotton slower. Hold for silk. The date beside it was March of 1971. Malik read the date 3 times before it did what it was going to do to him. The wage columns in front started in 95. This page came 24 years earlier, which meant the book had not gone from work into something else. It had gone the other direction. She had filled it from the front as a young woman, with something of her own, and then it had stopped. And then, decades later, she had turned back to the blank pages at the beginning and written down what a flour company paid her by the hour. The book was older than the job. He turned the page. April 2, marigold, onion skin, iron, water, old nails, vinegar, 2 weeks minimum. Then a list, and the list was exactly what the grading line threw away. Cosmos, coreopsis, zinnia, the leggy August dahlia nobody staked properly. Each one with a note beside it in that fast, small hand. Doesn't hold. Holds if mordanted. Holds beautifully. Don't forget this one. He sat in the doorway of that shed with the light coming across his hands and read holds beautifully 4 times. And the thing that got him was not the phrase. It was the instruction after it. Don't forget this one. She had been writing to somebody, to a version of herself she did not trust, maybe, or to somebody who wasn't born yet. The entries ran forward. 73, 76, 81. The handwriting got shorter as it went, the way handwriting does when a person stops taking notes and starts already knowing the answer before the question is finished. Then somewhere in the middle of the 80s it thinned, 2 entries in a year, 1. And then a run of blank pages so long that Malik's thumb kept going past them looking for something, and there was nothing. And the nothing had a shape he recognized from his own house that spring. The writing came back near the end, in a different pen. Darker ink, a tighter hand, the letters not quite closing. Coreopsis stems, rust brown, deep. Needs more time in the pot than I have anymore. The date on that page was the previous April, 11 months before she died, 40 years after the last entry before it. At the very back, pinned inside the cover with a straight pin that had rusted into the cloth, was a card. On the card were 7 words in a bigger, slower, older hand than anything else in the book. 40 minutes. No aluminum, no petals. He didn't know what a single one of those words meant in that order. He knew this much. His grandmother would write a grocery list on the back of a seed packet and lose it in a coat pocket for a season. She did not pin things. He put the ledger in the box with the photographs. And he did not tell his mother he had it, and he could not have told you why not either. The list in that book was a list of exactly what he dumped every night. That was the part he could not get past, lying in bed the next morning with the light coming around the blind. Not that his grandmother had a secret, that the secret was made of the specific material the farm paid a man to bury. She had written holds beautifully next to a flower Malik, personally shoveled into a hole 4 nights a week. He read the ledger for a week before he understood he was reading it wrong. He kept looking for the answer in the flowers. Which one, what color, how much, and the book kept refusing to be about that. The flowers were the easy part. Every 3rd page more or less said so. Coreopsis. Strong gold to rust. She wrote it the way you write down a thing you already have in your hands. The color was never in question. What the book was actually about was buried in a line he read past at least twice on the page with the crossed-out recipe, in the fast night hand. Cotton is stubborn and will lie to you for 2 washes. Bark first, then the alum. The bark is the whole thing on cotton. Without it the color sits on top and walks off in the second bath. Bark. He did not know what she meant, and the book assumed he already did, the way it assumed you knew what alum was and where you got it. But he took the word outside with him that evening and stood at the back of the White House garden where the beds had gone to seed, and he looked at the fence line, the tangle of stuff the farm and everybody else spends every autumn cutting back and burning. Oak scrub, a stand of staghorn sumac gone rust-red at the tips, a black walnut dropping hulls into the grass. He did not know yet that every one of those is a tannin. He only knew his grandmother had written the word bark, like it mattered more than the flower did, and that the fence row was the one thing on that half-acre nobody had ever once thought was worth anything. Here is the mechanism plainly, because the story does not work without it. There are 2 kinds of fiber: protein, wool, silk, and cellulose, cotton, linen. Almost every natural color there is takes beautifully on wool and fights you on cotton. A person who only ever dyed wool would think this was easy, and would think they were good at it. The reason cotton fights you is chemical. The metal in a mordant, alum is the common one, is what actually locks color into fiber, and on wool it grabs straight on. On cotton it will not grab, not until the fiber has first been run through a bath of tannin, which opens the cellulose up, so the metal has something to hold. Skip the tannin and the alum has nothing to bite, and the color lies on the surface. And it looks perfect coming out of the pot, and it is gone by the second wash. Tannin is not exotic. It is the bitter stuff in oak galls, in sumac, in walnut hulls and leaves, in ordinary tea. It is in the exact hedgerow scrub that every farm in the country treats as the thing you burn in the autumn. The competitor's version of this story. And there is a competitor's version. There is always a competitor's version. Has the boy solve cotton by simmering instead of boiling, using a steel pot instead of aluminium, stripping the petals off the stems. All three of those are real, and all three matter, and not one of them is the thing that makes cotton hold color. The thing that makes cotton hold color is a step that happens before the dye pot is ever lit, using a material everybody burns. Ruthie knew it. She wrote it down. She wrote it down for somebody who would not know it, which turned out to be her own grandson, standing at a fence line, at dusk, not knowing he was looking at the answer. The pit closed 8 days later. Denver Kalb had been running the farm for about a year and a half. He'd come from a distribution outfit in Columbus, wore a quarter zip in every weather, and had a way of delivering information that made it sound as though everyone reasonable had already agreed to it. He gathered the shift by the loading doors and told them the state had gotten firm about surface runoff on organic waste, which meant the pit was done, filled in by the end of the month. A licensed hauler out of Portsmouth would take the totes 3 nights a week starting in June. He said it like good news, because for the office it was one line item, one liability gone. Then he found Malik afterward at the truck, because there was a second half to it. Route goes away. The night driver goes away. Nothing personal, it's the position. Good through the 25th of June. Malik stood there with his hand on the mirror bracket, and the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the shed got louder. Once the pit was filled in, and a licensed hauler was coming 3 nights a week, the only supply of the only material his grandmother had ever bothered to hide would belong to a waste company in Portsmouth. So he asked. He heard his own voice do it before he decided to, whether the farm would sell him the waste. The totes, the seconds, whatever came off the end of the line that was going in a truck anyway, he'd pay for it. He'd take it by the ton if they wanted to weigh it. Denver looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, which was somehow worse. Pay for it with what? Malik didn't have an answer to that part. You want to buy the garbage. You're a driver, not a salesman. Nobody buys garbage, and if somebody did, we'd have sold it in 1980. Take the month, get your check. There's a warehouse in Chillicothe hiring. He walked back toward the office, and that was the end of it, as far as the company was concerned. If you're watching this somewhere with a fence line of your own, a field edge, a scrub lot, a stand of something everybody in your family has spent years cutting back and burning, tell me in the comments what grows in it. I read them. I've started to think the useful thing is almost never the thing anybody planted on purpose. That night, Malik backed the flatbed to the lip of the pit for the 400th time, or the 1000th, he'd never counted, and sat with his hand on the hydraulic lever and did not pull it. There were 2 ways out of the truck. 1, take the month, take the check, take the warehouse job in Chillicothe, with the shifts and the badge. Put the ledger in the closet with the plaque and the rubber bands, and be a person who knew a sad, interesting thing about his grandmother. 2, take a material that every single person for 40 years had already agreed was worthless, that he had no right to and no license for and no equipment for and no idea how to use, and prove them wrong before the 25th of June on $61 and a book he could barely read. He climbed onto the bed with the pail and filled it again, and set the second one in the footwell too. Only then did he pull the lever and let the rest of it go down into the dark. The account at the credit union in Waverly had $61.40 in it, and it was going to have to buy a pot. It didn't. His mother had a stock pot she used maybe twice a year, aluminium dented on one side, and Malik carried it out to the carport the first night and set it on the 2-burner propane rig she used for canning tomatoes in September. He filled it from the hose bib, dumped in the pail of coreopsis and cosmos, lit the burner, and stood in the dark waiting for water to boil. He read the ledger by the light of his phone while he waited, and the phone was at 19%, and the charger was in a truck he no longer wanted to walk out to. Everything in the book assumed a person who already knew things. 2 tablespoons alum assumed you knew what alum was. He'd found it that afternoon in the canning aisle at the grocery, $4 and change. A jar the size of his thumb, the single largest purchase he made that entire month. Mordant was a word he'd had to look up, and the definition, a substance that fixes a dye to a fiber, explained nothing about how much or how long or what happened when you got it wrong. By 11, the pot was going hard. A rolling boil, the stems tumbling over each other, the water turning a strong orange-brown that looked for about 4 minutes like the most promising thing he'd ever seen. He dropped in a square of an old flour sack towel and watched it go the color of the water. He pulled it at 40 minutes, because the pinned card said 40 minutes, wrung it out, and held it up under the carport bulb. It was orange, not the rust in her ledger. A flat, thin traffic cone orange that looked like it had been done to the cloth instead of grown into it. He hung it on the fence wire and went to bed at 1. At 6, the square on the wire had gone the color of weak tea. Not faded, gone somewhere else entirely, into a grey tan with no relationship to what he'd hung up. He stood there holding it in both hands, and it was the first time in his life that something he had made had visibly quit on him overnight. He tried again the next night and the night after. The pit was filled in on the 29th of May, exactly as Denver had said. 2 men in a track hoe pushed 40 years of black dirt back over the hole in a single afternoon, and Malik watched from the cab while the shape of it disappeared, and then there was just ground there, flat and raw. His route after that was 2 hours instead of 5, moving totes from the line to the dock and staging them for the hauler, which made the rest of the month feel less like a job than like a countdown somebody had put him on a stool to watch. Denise Marrow asked him straight out one afternoon what he was doing with the pails. Denise had 9 years on the line and a way of asking things that did not leave room to lie sideways. He told her the truth, more or less, because he was too tired to build anything else. He said he was trying to boil color out of them. She laughed. Not meanly. Boil color out of them, baby. They got a store for that. By the end of the week it had gotten around, and it had gotten around in the version that always travels furthest, that Malik Osei was picking through the trash. Not making, picking. 2 of the men on the dock started calling out prices when he walked past. $1 for that tote. $2 going once. He kept his mouth shut and kept filling pails. And the difference between that and stealing was a distinction the men joking about it did not make, and he knew that even then. What broke it open was not a discovery. It was reading 4 words he'd already read. He was in the truck one afternoon waiting on the hauler, and it went through him all at once. He had been boiling. Everything he'd made had been at a hard rolling boil in a dented aluminium pot with whole heads in it, petals and all, because petals are most of what comes off a grading line. The card said 40 minutes, no aluminum, no petals, 3 rules. He'd broken all 3 every night for a week. And the page said the rest of it, and he found it that evening. Simmer, don't boil. Skins and stems only, no petals. Petals bleed the wrong way. Steel, never aluminum. Aluminum lies to you about the color and bark first. Always the bark first. He didn't have a steel pot. He had a Saturday and a thrift store on the east end of Chillicothe, where he bought a 20-quart stainless canner with a sprung handle for $9. The rusted nails he did not have to buy. There was a coffee can of them in the carport, older than he was. And they went into white vinegar on the windowsill that night, 2 weeks minimum, the way the book said, for a purpose he didn't understand yet. And the bark. He went to the fence line at the back of the White House garden with a hand saw and cut an armload of the staghorn, sumac, the rust-tipped stuff, because a margin note 3 pages back said sumac. Quick, no color of its own to speak of, which he now understood was her telling him which tannin wouldn't muddy a gold. He didn't know that's what he understood. He just cut the sumac and not the walnut, and he was right, and he could not have said why. The batch that worked was the 2nd of June. Coreopsis stems, the long tough ones, stripped of every petal and leaf, which took him an hour and a half and left his fingers stained. The sumac simmered first, and the fiber soaked in it overnight. Then the fiber into the alum, and only then into the dye, water just trembling at the surface, never breaking, which meant riding the propane valve for 40 minutes like a man tuning a radio. Out at 40, hung wet. He hung it and went inside and did not look at it until morning, on purpose, because he'd learned by then that these things tell the truth in daylight and lie under a carport bulb. At 6:40 he came out with coffee he didn't drink and stood in front of the fence wire. It was a gold, but that was the wrong word, and he knew it standing there. It was the color of a photograph left in a drawer for 30 years. Warm and slightly used, a gold that had gone soft at its edges without going dull. It had depth when he moved his head. The cloth moved with him, lighter in one place, deeper where the weave crowded. He put his thumb on it and rubbed, hard, the way you rub a thing to see if it comes off. Nothing came off on his thumb. He rubbed again, harder, and looked at the pad of his thumb, and it was clean. And the cloth was still gold, and that was the whole thing right there. Industrial dye lies on top of the cloth. This was in it. He had rubbed 100 squares raw over a week, trying to make one of them do this, and the difference between all of those and this one was a bath of fence line scrub he'd cut with a hand saw because a dead woman told him to. He stood in his own driveway on a Tuesday morning at 10 to 7, with his heart going and understood, in a way he had not understood at any point in the week before, that his grandmother had not been doing a craft. She had been doing chemistry in a kitchen with a lamp turned low, and she had written down every step of it, and she had hidden it in a shed. He washed a square in the sink that night with dish soap, twice. In the morning it was the same. He washed a second square 4 times, same. Then he drove to Columbus. Noreen Voss ran a small studio in a converted storefront that made one-off pieces for stylists and kept a website with a page about naturally dyed textiles. Malik had found her on his phone at midnight, the way anyone finds anyone. He emailed her 3 photographs, and she wrote back in 40 minutes asking what the source material was. And he wrote one line, flower waste, a farm in Pike County, and she asked him to come up. He drove 70 miles with 4 swatches in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. Noreen took the swatches to the window before she said hello properly, held them at arm's length, then close, then turned one over to see whether the color had gone all the way through. Her thumbnail went across the weave. "Where's the rest of it?" He told her there wasn't a rest of it. 4 swatches and a stock pot in a carport. She asked what the fiber was, and he said an old flour sack, cotton, and she made a face he read as disappointment, which turned out to be the opposite. What she said, more or less, was that this gold on cotton was harder than this gold on wool, that everybody's naturally dyed cotton goes muddy or goes pale, and that whatever he'd done had gone into the fiber and stayed. Then she asked the question that changed the shape of the summer. "Can you make 40 yards?" He said yes. He said it before he'd done any arithmetic at all, standing in a studio in Columbus with a woman's card in his hand. And the yes came out of a place that had been waiting 19 years for somebody to ask him a question with a number in it. 40 yards of a mid-weight cotton, dyed in that gold, for a small collection going out in the fall. $400. And then she said, "And if it holds more." He drove home doing the math he should have done in the room. 40 yards was not 4 swatches. 40 yards was pounds and pounds of stems, hours of stripping, and a 20-quart pot that could handle maybe 3 yards at a time if he crowded it, which the ledger told him not to do. 3 yards a batch, 40 yards, 14 batches, and every batch needed the fiber to sit in the sumac overnight and then the alum overnight before it ever saw dye. Overnight in the tannin, longer for cotton, the book said. Cotton is stubborn and will lie for 2 washes, 14 times. In one pot, on a 2-burner rig, around a shift, he shortened it. He did it the way people do, not in one decision, but in 3. The first batch he pulled from the tannin at 8 hours instead of the full night, because he had to leave for the farm. The second at 6. By the 5th he had a rhythm going, and the rhythm was faster than the book, and the color came out looking right. That was the trap. It came out looking exactly right. There was nothing in the wet cloth or the dry cloth to tell him the color was sitting on the cotton instead of married to it. He tested it. That was what he told himself afterward, and it was even true. He washed a square from batch 4 in the sink with dish soap and it held. What he did not do was wash it twice, or wash it hot, or wash it after the piece had cured a week, because he had 19 days and then 11 and then 5. And a woman in Columbus waiting. He shipped 40 yards on the 15th of June. In cardboard boxes, he taped shut at midnight on the kitchen floor and drove them to the post office before his shift. While he waited to hear, he went looking in the book for the buyer. Not for a recipe this time, for the thing he'd started to feel was missing from it. 31 years of wages and 40 pages of dye notes, and not one line anywhere about selling a single dyed thing to a single person. She had figured out something people would stand in line for, and she had never once on any page written down that she'd sold it. Except she had. He found it because the crossed-out recipe had a pencil line under it so light he'd gone past it twice. Ask her about the buyer in Berea before you try this one. There was no buyer in Berea anywhere else in the book. And then, on the margin of a page dated 1986, a name written twice, one under the other, the way a person writes a name when they've started a letter and stopped. Karina Dare. Karina Dare. He called his Aunt Vera that night. She'd moved to Columbus in the 90s and come back for the funeral and not since. And she answered on the 4th ring with a television going. He asked whether their mother had ever sold dye to anybody. The television went quiet. He could hear her decide something. There was a man, before you were born, came up in a station wagon twice a year, and she'd have it boxed in the back room, and he paid her cash right there on the kitchen table. A pause. That was the year the water heater got replaced, and nobody said how. He asked whether the farm knew. The farm didn't exist for her yet. She didn't go out there till 95 after your grandfather passed, and when she did, she never said one word about it to a soul on that place. Vera was quiet for a second. She told me once, hands in the sink, don't touch that till I bleach it. And then out of nowhere she said that if they knew, it had stopped being hers. Malik sat in the kitchen a long time after that call. He'd spent a week thinking he was chasing a hobby. What he had in front of him now was a different thing. Starting in the 70s, a woman had built something out of the exact material a flower company would later pay a man to bury. She'd sold it for cash to a buyer with a station wagon, told nobody, and let it go so completely that her own daughter remembered it as a water heater. And then she'd walked onto that farm and let them pay her by the hour for 31 years. Without ever once mentioning that she already knew something they didn't. Nobody had stolen it from her. That was the part that sat wrong and kept sitting wrong. She had put it away herself on purpose, because she'd known exactly what happens to a woman on a grading line who turns out to have something the company wants. That was the night it stopped being a way out of a warehouse job in Chillicothe and turned into something else. And he could not have named it at 19. 18 months later, at the kitchen table with a reporter's pen going, he said it plainly. He stopped trying to make money and started trying to put a name back. Noreen Voss called on the 19th. She was decent about it the whole way through, which made it land harder. She'd run a wash test on 2 yards from the middle of the lot. Standard warm water, the way any buyer would before cutting into it. The water in my machine came out the color of weak tea, significant color loss. The goods were unusable for the collection. She was sending them back and was not asking for the 400. Then she said the thing he wrote down afterward, because it was the only piece of the call he could use. The swatches you brought me held, so you know how to do it. Something changed between the swatch and the lot, and you're the only person alive who can tell me what. He knew what. He knew it before she was off the phone. He'd rushed the tannin. The 4 swatches had sat in the sumac a full night, back when he was doing 1 square at a time and had nothing but time. The lot had sat 6 hours. 5, because a woman in Columbus had set a number, and he'd wanted to be a person who could deliver on a number. He sat in the carport that night and read the crossed-out recipe again, and this time it turned his stomach, because it was the same failure. She had written a method, used it, struck it through with 4 hard lines, and the notes crawling up the margin beside it were about a lot that had come apart the same way his had, washed out in the second bath. And about a decision she'd made afterward that the pencil line pointed at and the ledger never explained. Ask her about the buyer in Berea before you try this one. Decades earlier, in a kitchen on a cotton lot she couldn't stand behind, his grandmother had stood exactly where he was standing. She had left him the map, and he had rushed past the part of the map that said don't. Denver Kalb found out on the 22nd of June, 3 days before Malik's last shift. It came from the dock, the way it was always going to. Somebody had seen boxes going into the truck bed on the 15th, and somebody's cousin knew somebody who'd heard the kid from the night route had sold cloth to a shop in Columbus. Denver called him into the office at 2 in the afternoon, with the door open and the payroll clerk 8 feet away, which was its own kind of statement. He had a printed page in front of him, the employment agreement Malik had signed at 17, a paragraph highlighted in yellow. He read a piece of it out loud, almost apologetically. All material produced on company property, including waste product, cull, and byproduct, remains the property of Halloway Flour Company until title transfers to a licensed disposal contractor. You've been taking product off this farm and selling it. Am I wrong? Malik told him it was garbage. He said it before he could pick a better word, with more heat than he meant, and watched it land wrong. It's not garbage, it's byproduct. It's got a line on the disposal invoice, and that means it's got a value. That's not me. That's the paper you signed. He was suspended effective immediately, pending review, which everybody in that office understood was how you fire a person who has 3 days left without using the word. His badge went in a drawer. He was told not to come onto the property, including the equipment shed. And Malik heard equipment shed and thought about a grey locker at the end of a row and an upturned crate. What he noticed on the way out, and did not say anything about for a year and a half, was that nobody had asked him one single question about what he had actually made. Not one. There'd been a paragraph and a highlighter and a decision that was finished before he walked in. He'd come in with an answer, and it turned out there had never been a question. And Denver was not wrong. That was the whole shape of the trap. She had been their employee for 31 years. The book had been in their shed. The stems had come off their line. Every fact in that paragraph was a fact. What the paragraph did not contain, and could not, was that she had done it at night, in her own kitchen, on a lamp she paid for, out of failures nobody witnessed, and had hidden it from these exact people for 3 decades precisely because she knew a day like this existed somewhere in the future. The letter from the lawyer came the following Wednesday, and it was courteous the whole way through, which was somehow its worst quality. Halloway had been made aware that a former employee was in possession of business records belonging to the company. The records, a bound ledger, had been located in a company building and contained entries relating to work performed by a company employee during her employment. Return was requested within 10 days, and in a sentence Malik read maybe 15 times. The company reserved all rights with respect to any commercial use of the information contained therein. They were going to say she was theirs. Halloway had paid Ruthie Osei by the hour for 31 years, and never once asked what was under her fingernails. Now they were going to build a dye program on it, put it on a website. And the woman who'd figured it out with a lamp turned low would appear nowhere in the sentence. She had been erased once by her own hand on purpose to protect it. They were about to erase her a second time in public, to sell it. That was the thing that moved him off the failure and toward the fight, not the suspension, not the lot that washed out. It was the idea of her name going missing a second time, while a manager in a quarter zip described her 30 years of nights as a byproduct stream. The Historical Society in Berea had a phone number that rang 11 times. The buyer's store was a parking lot behind a tire shop now. The man himself, Walter Dare, had died in 1988, the only person alive who could confirm his grandmother had ever sold a dyed thing to anybody had been dead 38 years. But the volunteer gave him the daughter. Marjorie Ellison picked up on the second ring, like she'd been sitting next to the phone. He told her who he was and who his grandmother had been, and about a ledger with a name written twice in the margin. Karina Dare. Something came down on a wooden surface on her end. A cup, maybe. That's my mother. And the whole thing turned over in about 4 seconds. In a carport in Pike County, with a phone getting hot against his ear. He'd spent 2 months reading 3 words in pencil. Ask her about the buyer, as being about the buyer. It had never been about the buyer. The buyer was Walter. The her was Karina Dare, Walter's wife, and the knowledge had been hers. 2 women who knew fibre, writing to each other across a state line, and the men were the ones with the station wagon and the store. Marjorie's mother had died in 1989, a year after her father. That was why he'd closed the store and never spoke of the business again, as long as he lived. Then Marjorie told him about the letter. My father kept every piece of correspondence he ever got, filed by year. There's one I know you mean. She said it plainly, because she'd read it enough times to have stopped being surprised by it. The lot wasn't cancelled by him. Your grandmother cancelled it. 1982. She wrote and told him she couldn't in good conscience send the goods, that the mordant hadn't taken the way it needed to on cotton, that the colour wouldn't survive a second washing, and she'd rather lose the account than put her name on work that came apart in somebody's sink. A pause. He kept it because he told me one time it was the only cancellation letter he ever got in his life that made him respect the person more for sending it. Malik drove down 2 Saturdays later, 211 miles, most of it 2-lane. He took a bucket of stems from his grandmother's own overgrown garden because he'd asked on the phone whether Marjorie wanted to see where the colour came from. And she'd laughed, a short, surprised sound, like nobody had offered her anything in a while. She made coffee he didn't drink and talked for 3 hours about a store he'd never seen. Then she went out to the garage and came back with a folder. The letter was 1 page, typed on a home machine with the E struck low, and at the bottom, in the round daytime hand from the front of the ledger, not the fast night one, was a full signature. Eleanor Ruth Osey. Under it, an address on a half-acre in Pike County that had never had one thing to do with Halloway Flour Company, and a date 13 years before she ever set foot on that farm. Stapled to the back was a swatch of cotton about 4 inches square. She'd sent it with the apology, not the failed goods, a piece from a batch she would stand behind, cut and enclosed, so the man would know what she'd been trying to give him. It had been in a filing cabinet in a garage in Kentucky since 1982, 44 years. It had not moved a single degree. Malik held it up next to a piece of his own June lot, and there was no argument to have. His was a colour that had been applied to cloth. Hers was a colour that had become the cloth. He asked if he could photograph the letter. Take it, she said. He understood 3 things on the drive home, somewhere south of Maysville in the dark with the windows down. The first was that he had proof. Not that the colour worked, the swatch was that. Proof of authorship. A signed letter, dated, sent from her own house to an out-of-state buyer more than a decade before Halloway ever hired her, on a matter of standards no company on earth could claim to have taught her. They could say she'd learned it in their shed. They could not say it in front of that page. The second arrived without any comfort attached. She had stood in exactly his place, a cotton lot that wouldn't hold, a buyer waiting, a number on the table she needed. And she had written the letter and lost the account. He had done the opposite, and the reason his lot faded was a reason she had already written down for him, in her own hand, on a page he'd read and gone past. The third was a number, and it was not in the folder. It was on the disposal, invoice. He'd staged those totes for the licensed hauler for 3 weeks before they walked him out, and he'd seen the weight tickets at the gate. The disposal summary, Denise Marrow photographed it off the dock bulletin board for him, had it in the second paragraph. Billed per ton received, no guaranteed minimum tonnage. Portsmouth was paid for what showed up. If less showed up, they were paid less. Nobody breached anything, which meant the wall that had ended his summer was not a wall. It was a bill. Malik did not call a lawyer. He wrote to Denver and asked for 20 minutes, and he brought paper, because he'd learned in that office in June that his word by itself had never once been the thing that got answered. They met in the second week of August, door shut, payroll clerk gone for the day. He put 4 things on the desk in an order he'd thought about the whole drive in. The letter with the swatch stapled to the back, and a printed page of the Historical Society's directory listing beside it. So a man who knew nothing about fiber could see that the author of this predated the farm by 13 years. His failed June swatch laid next to Marjorie's gold. So the same man could see in 1 second what 44 years looked like and what 6 weeks looked like. The per-ton disposal figure and the no minimum clause, written out on a feed receipt in his own hand, and the offer. He'd buy the byproduct stream by weight at the gate, on the same scale Portsmouth used. Halloway would stop paying to dispose of everything he took. He'd haul it himself, on his own trailer, his own insurance, his own time, and the company would carry no liability past the scale. On top of that, a percentage of finished goods. He named a real one, and one condition, last, because he'd put it last on purpose. The name on the product would be hers. The ledger stayed in his family, and the letter from the lawyer went away. Denver looked at the 2 swatches for a long while. Then he asked the only question a man in that chair was ever going to ask. What happens to the letter, the 82 one, afterward? Nothing. It's not a threat. It's just why the name isn't yours to give away. He signed 11 days later. Not because it was fair. Malik never once pretended otherwise. He signed because the arithmetic on that feed receipt turned a line item that cost money every month into one that paid, and because the alternative was building a dye program from nothing, with a lawyer's letter and a manager who had never once simmered a stem in his life. Now the part that has to be said, because a story like this ends 1 paragraph too early if you let it. It is not a fortune, and it is not going to become one. The first order was 40 yards, a few $100s. Naturally dyed cloth is a narrow trade that lives and dies on a small number of buyers, and the color is not immortal. Coreopsis with a proper tannin is good, genuinely good, wash fast and reasonably light fast, which is more than almost any flower gives you. It is not indigo, and it is not walnut. Left in a sunny window for years, it will still move. Malik says so on the tag, in 1 line, because his grandmother would have, and because a woman in Columbus once told him the only unforgivable thing is a color that lies about what it is. He sent Noreen Voss her $400 back. She'd never asked for it. And 40 yards to replace the lot that failed dyed right, with a 1-sentence note and no excuse attached. She wrote back that she'd keep the check as a deposit against the next order. It was the first order Ruthie Dye Works ever filled twice. The truck still comes every night. That is the part he likes best. Nothing about the flowers changed. The same totes come off the same grading line, with the same bent necks and split calyxes, loaded by the same men who used to call out prices when he walked past with a pail. They just don't go in a hole anymore. They cross the scale at the gate and go 4 miles up the road and into a line. Steel drums twice a month to New York, with a bill of lading instead of cardboard boxes taped shut on a kitchen floor. Sharon keeps the books. She said yes to that in October, in the same flat voice she'd used about the stock pot, and then spent a Sunday copying all 31 years of wage entries out of the front of the ledger into a spreadsheet without being asked and without explaining why. She moved into the White House the week after. It turned out the thing that let her walk in the door was having a reason to be in it. Denise Marrow runs the second vat now. She put in 9 years on the grading line before she came over, and she runs it better than Malik ran the first one. And both of them know it, and neither says it more than twice a year. The bucket still gets filled at the end of every day and set by the workshop door. It never gets boiled. In the morning he looks at it before anything else happens, and a reporter once asked him why he kept that up when he didn't need the reminder anymore. And he said it plainer than he meant to, because the day I stop needing it, is the day I turn into somebody who doesn't notice what's getting thrown out on the end of every drum that leaves that farm, and on the label of every finished yard, there is one word. Ruthie. She had erased it herself once to keep it safe. They were going to erase it a second time to sell it. It took a 19-year-old with $61 and a book he could barely read the better part of a summer to put it back. And the only thing he ever really did was refuse to let 2 tons of anything be worth nothing at all.